Hello, I'm Julia Moore, a DPhil student in English and French literature at the University of Oxford, and today I'm going to be speaking to Anne Serre and Mark Hutchinson about Anne's book A Leopard-Skin Hat, which was translated into French by Mark. It was published at Lolly Editions in 2024 and was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2025, and it has also been shortlisted, and that's why we're here today, for this year's inaugural Schools Laureate. Anne was born in Bordeaux and is the author of 17 works of fiction. Her work has been praised both for its simplicity and for its magical fairy tale-like imaginative quality. She has won, amongst many distinctions, the 2008 Signo del Duca Foundation Award and the 2020 Prix Goncourt de la Nouvelle. 4 of her works have been translated into English. And Mark Hutchinson was born in London and lives in Paris. He has translated widely, notably the poets René Char and Emmanuel Aucard. His translation of René Char's The Inventors was one of The Independent's best poetry books of 2015. Mark and Anne, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed for the student readers of the Schools Laureate, and I should probably show the wonderful book here. Thank you so much. Anne, my first question is for you, and I should say to the students that Anne will be responding in French, and we'll have subtitles. So the book, Anne, comes from your personal life. It is a portrait of your sister and of the mental illness she faced. It was written as a response to a tragedy, which is her death, yet it is also a beautiful portrait. There are vivid pictures of the protagonist, Fanny, of her clothes, her literary interests, the way she sits. It feels like an illuminating close reading of a person, the way you might read a poem or a work of literature. And I wanted to ask you if you could please speak to me more about how you began to write this book and this process.
Thank you, Julia. En fait, c'est un livre un peu particulier dans mon travail parce que d'habitude, je n'écris jamais à partir d'un événement de ma vie. J'écris à partir de toutes sortes d'images, de phrases qui me traversent et qui m'inspirent. Mais c'est rare que je démarre à partir d'un événement. Mais là, après la mort de ma sœur, je n'avais pas d'autres images que des images d'elle, contrairement à d'habitude où je suis traversée de toutes sortes d'images. Là, ce qui dominait, c'était des images d'elle. Donc, ça s'imposait. Mais alors, ce qui est très intéressant dans mon expérience, c'est que les images de ma sœur n'étaient pas exactement comme des images de souvenirs. C'était comme si c'était déjà des images de fiction. En fait, c'était des images, c'est comme si c'était des images de lecture, qui me venaient de lecture que j'avais faites, ou de rêverie. Donc, c'était un départ très intéressant pour moi. Et donc, voilà, il y a ces images, et j'ai compris que ces images allaient se succéder, mais quand même, ce qui m'a permis de commencer le livre, c'est quand même une phrase, et c'est une phrase d'un livre que j'avais lu dans mon enfance, un livre d'Alphonse Daudet qui s'appelle La chèvre de Monsieur Seguin, qui est un livre pour les petits-enfants, qui est l'histoire d'une jeune chèvre très courageuse, qui a très envie de liberté, qui s'enfuit dans la montagne où elle va être tuée. Et j'ai repris cette phrase pour commencer mon livre, et à ce moment-là, toutes les images que j'avais de ma sœur se sont succédées les unes après les autres et ont commencé à former un livre. Et ce qui me paraissait important, c'est que ce livre soit très vivant, que pour parler de quelqu'un qui va vers la mort, puisque c'est ça l'histoire du livre, eh bien, pour parler de quelqu'un qui est sur ce chemin-là, qui va vers la mort, il fallait que le livre soit très vivant. Voilà comment ce livre est né, en fait.
Oui, il est très vivant, en effet. It's such a lively book. And I'm so interested in what you're saying about this kind of succession which seems natural. Did you keep the images in the order in which they appeared to you then? Or the order in which you kind of remember them?
Alors, c'est toujours ce qui se passe quand j'écris. J'ai toutes sortes d'images qui arrivent. Et c'est comme si les images s'engendraient les unes après les autres. Chaque image accouche d'une autre image. Bon. Et j'ai l'habitude de de garder les images qui ont du relief, qui ont un dessin très précis,
Mm.
et je ne garde pas les images qui sont plus floues ou plus pâles ou plus. Voilà, mon choix se fait comme ça. Mais je ne change pas l'ordre. Non, non. Je suis fidèle à l'ordre des images qui me viennent à l'esprit. Euh,
Oui, c'est fascinant. C'est comme presque un montage au cinéma. It's like a sort of way in the cinema of taking the kind of key moments and sort of cutting away pieces in the middle, I suppose.
yes, exactly. Mm.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I suppose that sort of leads me to my next question about the kind of the way the novel is structured around the point of view of this unnamed narrator, um, who is a close childhood friend of Fanny, and is explicitly dissociated from some sort of authorial first person. I'm really interested, and that feels quite cinematic to me as well, actually, um, this kind of gaze or this way of looking, which is kind of mediated through that narrator. So I wondered if you could maybe describe the narrator and his sensibility, and tell me a little more about this process of writing from obviously, as you say, unusually for you, and a kind of personal or intimate story, and yet still away from the first person.
Vous savez, quelques années avant A Leopard-Skin Hat, j'ai écrit un livre, un roman, qui s'appelle Le narrateur. Et dans ce roman, je décris un personnage qui est un homme, middle age, euh, et je décris ce personnage qui est un peu mystérieux, dont la vie consiste à créer des histoires. Donc j'ai créé un personnage qui s'appelle le narrateur. Et, euh, et ce personnage, c'est celui qui revient dans ce livre. Là, il est l'ami de Fanny, l'ami de... euh, alors, votre question est passionnante, parce que la question du narrateur est passionnante. Euh, le narrateur d'un roman, sauf dans l'autofiction où le narrateur est identique à l'écrivain, c'est la même personne. Mais quand on n'est pas dans l'autofiction, et moi je ne suis pas du tout dans l'autofiction, quand on est dans la fiction, le narrateur, en fait, c'est un personnage que l'écrivain invente, comme un autre personnage en réalité, mais
Mm.
auquel il prête simplement une voix. Mais c'est l'écrivain qui invente son narrateur, et c'est évidemment un personnage qui est très inspiré de lui-même. Mais c'est pas lui-même, c'est pas l'écrivain, c'est un personnage créé par l'écrivain. Et en quoi c'est intéressant de faire ça? À mon sens en tout cas, je pense que ce personnage créé par l'écrivain permet d'aller beaucoup plus loin dans le récit. Parce que, en réalité, au fond, c'est un personnage, non, au fond, c'est la part de l'écrivain qui est reliée très fort à son inconscient.
Mm.
Euh, c'est ça le narrateur, en réalité, pour tous les écrivains. Euh, Parce que c'est mystérieux, le narrateur. On se demande toujours, mais qui parle dans un roman? Qui raconte? Et alors voilà, c'est une part de l'écrivain très reliée à son inconscient et dont il fait comme un double en quelque sorte. Et
Mm.
tout l'intérêt, à mon sens, tout l'intérêt de cette création d'un narrateur, qui n'est pas soi exactement, c'est que ça permet d'aller plus loin dans la connaissance de l'histoire qu'on est en train de raconter.
Mm. Yes, that's very interesting actually, this idea of a double. Um, I suppose it reminds me almost of the role that a translator might have. I mean, that sort of struck me, this idea that Mark might almost be acting in a similar way. I don't know if that's too fanciful. Um, but this sort of way in which the narrator does kind of reveal something of an original or of a kind of the author's point of view. And I wanted to ask you, Mark, I mean, you've been Anne's translator in English for years now, and I believe you're good friends, and both in print and in magazines. And I wanted maybe you to describe the translation process, whether this was a particularly difficult work to translate, or whether, on the other hand, it seemed almost natural to you to take on the voice of a male narrator who's Fanny's friend and confident, this almost body double, which a translator sometimes is. I wonder how you feel about that characterization.
Um, well, let's start. If I start at the end of that, the fact that the narrator is nominally male, to be honest, I don't think that's sort of hugely important in the book. I mean, I think that's more a
Mm,
sort of it's a doubling device for Anne, a distancing device, so
mm,
she can, you know, stand back a little bit, from
mm,
her own private experience, and gives her a kind of
mm,
fictional hold in it. And I
mm,
don't think, although obviously, if you read a book by Jane Austen or Virginia Woolf, you know perfectly well as a woman writing the book. I mean, it's obvious from multiple things, but it's not the language as such that is gendered. It's the kind of things the writer notices, or the angle at which they sort of
mm.
stand to the world, um, and so forth. So I don't think I sort of oh great, it's a male narrator, that's going to make life much easier, because
No, I didn't, to be clear, I didn't mean to suggest that kind of explicitly, although I suppose I was sort of going there. I'm more thinking about how this character of the narrator um kind of fits in with the character of the translator. But yeah, I take the point. That's very interesting.
oh, you mean like the narrator as a
C'est ça.
double of the
Yeah,
translator?
exactly.
Yes, there is something. I think there is something with that. I think that's sort of fair. But I mean, it's not something you're very preoccupied with when you're working, because
Mm,
when you're working, you're just doing the stuff. It's in the same way that if you play tennis, you don't think about what you're doing when you're playing tennis. You just play. You know,
mm,
you don't sort of think about the theory of tennis, or the way the court is mapped out, or you're just involved in the work sort of thing, and your work is just, you have your work cut out. Simply, you've just got to get all the sentences, um, and the whole paragraph, and then the whole page, and then the whole book, and you've got to get all the sentences sort of lined up next to each other, and properly tuned, and take out all the
mm,
slack in them, and find the exact equivalent, and check for the 27th time that you haven't missed a nuance, or introduced something that isn't there in the French,
mm,
that's slipped in by mistake or something. So you're just constantly kind of fiddling around, adjusting things. And then when you've got everything sort of more or less in place, and it's accurate, and then it's starting to sort of shape up in English. At that point, usually, ideally, the English starts to kick in its own right. You sort of forget about the book slightly at that stage, and and then you start being guided by the English. The English is wanting to. The book will start sort of pulling in a certain direction. That's the most sort of creative part of translation, if you like, is when the English is sufficiently, accurate, and lively, and then it's sort of everything's more or less in place. But then
mm,
the book wants, the English text sort of takes on slightly a life of its own, and then when you've done that, you have to sort of go back and check that the book, in taking on a life of its own, hasn't sort of gone galloping off in some direction that is not
mm,
actually in the French. You haven't taken too many lips, so you're constantly sort of in this
mm,
back and forth between, because the language at some point, it says, no, I don't want to do this. I want to go down this road.
mm,
The language is telling you where to go, you know, in the same
yeah.
way that it does with a writer. That's the sort of writerly side of it. Sorry,
Mm,
that was a bit
yeah.
long-winded as an answer, probably.
No, that's really interesting because I think it relates really to also equality in Anne's own style, which has this kind of at once kind of hugely resonant images. I'm really interested that you think of it as that, as a series of images, and also a kind of control and economy of form, which is kind of fascinating. I mean, students and who are reading your book will notice that it's quite short and maybe it's best described as a novella. You've also written short stories, for instance, in Au cœur d'un été tout en or. And I wanted to know, I mean, you're kind of making Mark's life more difficult, I suppose, by writing with such economy and writing in such short form. And I wondered what it allows you to do, this kind of short gem-like precise writing.
Je, j'ai l'habitude de penser, parce que j'ai réfléchi à ce choix de la forme courte, évidemment. Je pense que la forme courte, la nouvelle ou la novella, je pense qu'il s'agit toujours, pour l'auteur, de traiter du point incandescent d'un drame. Alors que dans un roman, plus vaste, plus ample, l'auteur s'occupe plutôt des causes et des conséquences du drame, de tout ce qu'il y a autour du drame. Tous les livres racontent un drame, hein, tous les livres racontent un drame. Alors la novella, irait directement dans le feu et s'intéresserait à décrire ce que c'est que ce feu du drame. Tandis que le romancier, la romancière, s'intéresse à tout le monde, tout ce qu'il y a autour de ce drame. Et du coup, c'est aussi une autre conception du temps. Parce que la nouvelle ou la novella, finalement, ressemble à un instant, alors que on est moins dans la chronologie. Moi, la chronologie d'une histoire m'intéresse pas tellement, alors que le romancier s'intéresse beaucoup à la chronologie. C'est très important pour le romancier, la circulation dans le temps. Pour le nouvelliste ou pour l'adepte des formes courtes, vous voyez là, par exemple, je pense à Bartleby, qui est un des plus grands exemples de la forme courte et un chef-d'œuvre absolu. Bartleby s'intéresse à une chose, c'est au silence de Bartleby. Voilà, c'est tout. Le drame, c'est ça. C'est le silence de Bartleby. Pourquoi Bartleby ne parle pas, à part un mot? Il ne peut dire qu'un seul mot. Pourquoi il ne... Voilà. C'est tout. C'est toute l'histoire. Il n'y a rien d'autre. Il n'y a pas avant, il n'y a pas après, il n'y a pas autour. Il y a juste ce point-là.
Yeah, exactly, capturing kind of instance. And I suppose, yeah, I suppose that's what makes A Leopard-Skin Hat so remarkable as well, because it's written, as we discussed, in a series of sort of scenes or moments. But as you say, they're kind of taken in chronological order for you, for the writer, but they're not quite chronological, perhaps, in the progression of the book. The setting moves quite fluidly from the countryside to the city, and Fanny's psychological state also seems to be in flux. Sometimes it filters in more closely to the narration. It's like it's closer to the reader. Sometimes it becomes more inaccessible. For me, that reminds me of actually Virginia Woolf, something like To the Lighthouse. But I was wondering how you picked these scenes. I suppose you've kind of responded to that part already, but perhaps you could talk more about how you conceived of and structured the moments of transition, whether that word transition is too chronological or too novel-like for you. That would be interesting for me to know.
Alors, comme je vous disais tout à l'heure, j'écris donc avec une succession d'images. Et une fois que le livre, quand je commence le livre, je ne sais pas très bien où je vais, mais une fois que le livre est commencé, au fur et à mesure, alors je commence à avoir une idée de sa composition. Exactement comme si je faisais un tableau ou si j'écrivais une musique. Je commence à avoir une idée de la composition d'ensemble. C'est pas très précis, c'est un peu flou, mais je commence, et plus j'avance, plus j'ai cette idée de l'ensemble. Je parle pas de l'histoire, de ce qui va se passer, c'est pas ça. C'est ce que vous décrivez, c'est-à-dire là où ça va être intense, là ça va être plus doux, là où ça va être sombre, là où ça va être lumineux, là où ça va être aigu, là où ça va, voilà, c'est ça. Ce n'est pas, c'est pas ce qui va se passer dans l'histoire, hein. C'est vraiment voilà, comme des volumes, ou des accents, ou des, et voilà, voilà comment je compose. Mais vraiment, quand je dis ça, j'ai l'impression que c'est comme si je composais un peu de la musique. Je ne suis pas une grande musicienne, hein, mais j'ai l'impression que c'est un peu comme ça que ça se passe, avec des idées de volume, de son, de rythme, pas avec des idées de ce que je raconte. Hein.
Yes, that's very interesting, this kind of relationship to music, or to maybe visual composition, even moments of kind of heaviness, lightness, visual kind of descriptors. I suppose in the novel as well, I mean, Fanny plays the piano. There are kind of multiple pianos that she plays at. There's also the physical description of her body, what she's wearing. So I suppose I mean, yeah, I suppose it does kind of come through in the book that you're so interested in these kind of in visual kind of decoration, or visual art, and also in music. I wondered if that was kind of, again, if these moments for you, for instance, certain clothes that Fanny might be wearing, I mean, it's in the title, the leopard skin hat, or certain moments of music, did you kind of, how did those kind of come to you, or were there things that or outfits that needed to be in the book, for instance?
Non, ça surgit comme ça. Ça surgit comme ça. Et ça surgit comme ça pendant que je suis en train d'écrire. Quand je ne suis pas en train d'écrire, quand je suis dans la vie, ce ne sont pas les bonnes images qui surgissent forcément. Mais quand je suis engagée dans le livre, en train d'écrire le livre, alors il faut dire que je fais très confiance, une confiance enfantine, à mon imagination. C'est-à-dire, je respecte ce que mon imagination me livre. Et sauf, parfois, mon imagination fait des erreurs. Alors, je les repère et je dis non, cette image-là ou cette scène-là, j'en veux pas. Ou cette phrase-là, elle est idiote, je n'en veux pas. Parfois, mon imagination se trompe. Mais en général, quand je suis en train de travailler, elle fonctionne bien, comme une petite usine. Et alors, ce qui jaillit, ce sont des images très précises. Justement, quand vous faites allusion aux vêtements, non, à ce moment-là, je voyais très clairement une veste avec tous ses boutons et son col et son étoffe, etc. Ça se passe, oui, ça se passe comme ça. C'est donné, c'est donné.
Yes, the kind of precision of imagination, la précision d'imagination. That's interesting. It feels almost like the opposite of perhaps sometimes when Proust is bringing you through pieces of music, or now I'm going to talk about Botticelli, and it kind of feels inserted. I think for you there's a kind of different, seems to be a different stylistic rapport. And I suppose that leads me to a question for Mark, which is, how would you describe the process of reconstructing this kind of very particular atmosphere and style, which is distinctive to Anne's work? This combination of simplicity and then huge amount of imagination.
Yeah, well, this question about atmosphere and sort of mood and stuff like this, I'm a bit of a sort of materialist on this. I think it's, it's not something I really have to sort of worry about. And it's not something you can just sort of say, okay, I've done all the rest. Now I'm going to deal with the atmosphere and mood. It's sort of embedded in the words that you're, the sentences and paragraphs and pages you're lining up. Once everything is in place, the mood comes about of its own accord. In the same way that if you have a certain combination of air and water and condensation, and wind and gravity, you'll get a particular pattern of clouds in the sky. Or in the same way you go out in a crack of dawn in autumn and there will be a sort of slight mist over the fields because the sun is heating up the earth, and it's a physical thing. And so all I really have to worry about is the words and the sentences and the paragraphs and that's quite enough. It's really very hard work. So I don't want to have, and the mood, the mood is an extension of Anne's wording and her vision of things. So if I get those, lined up all properly, and the only area in which I think I'm sort of consciously contribute to that would be rhythm, because rhythm, as far as I'm concerned, is like a writer's fingerprint. It's like the way people walk. You can always imitate people's, your friends. I love, it's one of my favorite sort of things, impersonating my friends. Everyone has a way of walking, so if I do an impersonation, you'll immediately know who I'm imitating, sort of thing. So it's the rhythm of a writer is a bit, that's the only, I stick very closely to the rhythms of Anne's. And when I say closely, I mean, you can't do this always, because there's some places where it's just not possible for all kinds of reasons, not even desirable. But I do, if you take a paragraph of Anne, a paragraphs of mine, basically the sentences are the same length and have the similar rhythm. And in a lot of instances, they'll have, like Anne's will be a 10-syllable sentence followed by a 6-syllable sentence followed by a 14-syllable sentence or something, because this happens quite a lot in French prose. They tend to fall out into quite regular patterns, once the writing is proceeding smoothly. So you get a very distinct rhythm. And, there are translators who just switch things around and transpose things much more. There's a wonderful old translator called David Coward, and I remember looking at one of his Maigret translations, one of his Simonal translations, and he just kind of flipped the whole first page of the book and just shuffled everything, and it was brilliant. But I don't do, that's not my sort of thing at all. And I can't, it's not only I don't do that, you have to do that sometimes in poetry and stuff like that. You have to flip stuff around. And by flipping it around, you actually manage to get closer to reproducing the thing, bizarrely, by transforming it in some way. But in Anne's, I nearly always find that the closer I stick to her rhythms and her sentences, the better it works. She doesn't need transposing in that way. So all my effort is sort of goes in that direction. So atmosphere, yes, atmosphere and mood, if that's an extension of rhythm, which I think it probably is. If you see what I mean, getting a little bit abstract here, but
no. Certainly in the kind of musical or episodic composition, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I suppose, Anne, I also wanted to ask you about, I'm going to come in a minute to your notebooks, which have been published in February of this year. But I suppose since we've been talking, or since Mark mentioned poetry, why don't I ask you first about for your kind of combination of brevity and also your use of the notebook form, which we can discuss more later, which was pioneered by poets like Paul Valéry, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, not French. I don't know why I did the accent. Anyway, your work sort of reminds me in some ways of poetry, this kind of sense of rhythm, of music, of episode, of brevity. And I wanted to ask you what your relationship to poetry and to poems is.
What a question.
Big question.
Eh bien, honnêtement, je ne lis pas beaucoup de poésie. Pas beaucoup. Aujourd'hui. J'en ai lu davantage quand j'étais jeune. Et quand j'étais jeune, comme vous le disiez, j'ai beaucoup lu Valéry. J'ai beaucoup lu les cahiers de Valéry, mais aussi sa poésie. Et ce poète a été important pour moi quand j'avais 20 ans ou 22 ans. Et alors, c'est la première fois que j'en parle, je crois, parce qu'on oublie, on a tellement lu, on a lu des milliers d'œuvres, etc. Et je pense que tout de même, quand j'ai lu Arthur Rimbaud, quand j'étais jeune, là encore, je pense tout de même, et d'ailleurs je suis décidée à le relire très vite, je pense tout de même que la poésie de Rimbaud a eu une grande importance pour moi. Voilà. Alors, c'est pas la peine de citer 20 poètes, puisque j'en ai lu d'autres, naturellement. Mais c'est vrai que moi, je vais vers la fiction. Le pays qui m'attire depuis toujours, depuis que j'ai 12 ans, c'est la fiction. Donc, c'est là où je vais naturellement. Voilà. Et sinon, je rajouterai pour la poésie que j'ai quand même en la personne de mon vieil ami et traducteur maintenant, Marc, mais on se connaît depuis très longtemps, on s'est rencontrés quand on était jeunes à Paris. Marc, lui, connaît la poésie, à mon avis, comme pas beaucoup, peu de gens. Et donc, Marc ne cesse de me parler de poésie. Il me parle de poésie sans cesse. Il m'envahit de poésie en m'en parlant. Donc, voilà d'où vient ma connaissance de la poésie. Elle vient de mon voisin. Mais j'ai une oreille attentive. Donc, j'entends ce qu'il dit de la poésie. Ouais.
Can I add something here?
Yeah.
Just to complicate this picture.
Yeah.
I would also say that, Anne you read quite a lot of tu lisais pas mal de Michaud aussi.
C'est vrai.
Henri Michaud, but of course he was mostly writing in prose. Like a lot of French poets, it's a very complicated subject I won't go into, but a lot of French poets end up writing prose. There's a very simple reason for it. It's because there's no lexical stress there's no word stress in French. So when you want to create an effect of syncopation, you have to be a genius like Rimbaud. He has a very clever way of doing this by doubling vowels next to each other and doubling consonant sounds. And so he creates the effect of a highly accented language. But French doesn't have word stress,
Michaud, revient à Michaud, c'est très intéressant.
So Michaud, Michaud, like a lot of poets, Belgian, not French, but moved into prose, because then you can start getting, proper syncopation in French prose. It's much easier. So Anne, I would point out, and I would also point out, although we don't talk about this is a secret, but so I'm not going to tell you what it's called. But she did actually, when she was a teenager, she did, in her late teens, she did actually write poems.
Yes.
And she actually composed, she actually, self-published in one of those little places where you take your manuscript down and and you give them £100 and they give you, 50 or 100 cheap copies of Roniode of your thing. She did actually write a little book of poems.
I started like this.
And this is her first book was a little book of poems that she went round and she went round the terraces of restaurants in Paris selling them to diners, saying, she's a sort of pretty girl, 19-year-old, and with a, charming smile and said, I've written this book over, would you like to buy a copy for £1.50 or what it was?
It's right. It's
so that's just to sort of correct the record. So there is a kind of complicated backstory of poetry in Anne. And
I started as a poet, and then I became a short novelist.
A fiction writer.
A fiction writer.
Yeah.
That's wonderful, actually, as a kind of story of beginning writing and beginning writing poetry. Absolutely. I mean, I think this relationship between poets and prose is you're right, uniquely French. And maybe students who are thinking of studying French might kind of enjoy this idea that actually French poetry isn't just these kind of moments of like intense kind of organized rhythm, but that it's also, especially in the 20th century or at the turn of the 20th century, a moment of kind of disconnection, like in Rimbaud's Illuminations, although I suppose that's earlier. I think that's 1873. So yeah, this is wonderful. And I suppose it brings me back to a question that I had really wanted to ask you, Anne, which is about, I mean, I'm really interested in your notebooks. Again, there seems to be a text there with Valérie. And they're published in a book called Rêve cette nuit, which was published in Verdier, at Verdier in February of this year. There are extracts online in magazines as well if students want to read those. They're a wonderful record of thinking and reading. And in one of them, you quote the American novelist Carson McCullers, who's actually also a favorite of Fanny's in A Leopard-Skin Hat, who says essentially that she's kind of struggling because she's every day, daily, writing a book that she does not understand. And I wanted to ask you really, I suppose, prosaically, what your daily work is like. What does it look like to be a writer, for you?
You know, to be a writer, it's not only an activity. Pardon, je parle français. Être un écrivain, évidemment, ce n'est pas seulement une activité, c'est une manière de vivre. Donc c'est une manière de vivre assez facile à décrire. C'est une manière d'être attentif tout le temps, tout le temps. C'est comme si on était en permanence en train de guetter quelque chose. On attend quelque chose qui devrait se produire, comme quelque chose qui devrait arriver, je ne sais pas, une apparition ou quelque chose d'étrange qui devrait tout d'un coup se monter. Voilà, on est dans une espèce d'attente et d'attention à tous les signes, à tous les signaux, d'attention à ce qu'on entend, à ce qu'on voit, à ce qu'on pense, à ce qu'on imagine.
C'est un espion.
Voilà, Marc dit c'est être un espion. Oui, moi je vois ce que beaucoup d'écrivains disent ça. Moi je dirais pas être un espion exactement, mais en tout cas c'est être dans cet état d'éveil. Voilà, d'éveil permanent pour recueillir. Voilà, j'arrive mieux à dire maintenant ce que je veux dire. C'est un état d'éveil permanent pour recueillir toutes les choses qui vont nous servir à construire une demeure. Parce qu'en fait, ces choses qu'on entend dans une conversation, ces choses qu'on lit quand on lit, qu'on voit quand on regarde un film, ou qu'on voit dans la rue, ou qu'on voit... voilà. Pourquoi on regarde tant? Parce que partout, il y a des petits éléments qui vont vous servir à construire, on dira votre œuvre, ce qui est un peu prétentieux, mais moi je dis votre demeure. Je trouve ça plus joli. Et voilà, donc oui, donc j'efface un peu le début de ce que j'ai répondu, parce que voilà, je vous réponds comme je pense, mais parfois il faut un peu de temps avant d'arriver à savoir ce qu'on pense vraiment. Et voilà ce que je pense vraiment, c'est ça. C'est cette attention pour recueillir vite, comme un objet, comme ça. On reconnaît, il est à vous, il est fait pour construire votre demeure. Et voilà, c'est ça la vie quotidienne. Ça a l'air un peu fantasque, mais alors,
je bâtis ma demeure.
Alors il y a des jours où je ne trouve rien, bien sûr. Hein. Je ne fais pas de cueillette tous les jours. Il y a des jours où je ne trouve rien et où je suis sombre. Voilà.
Donc tu es un maçon.
Oui, je suis un maçon.
He's a mason.
Oui, yes,
He's a bricklayer.
Yeah, that's quite beautiful actually, this kind of idea that it sort of, I suppose, is a different conception of being a writer, which connects you to, like a magpie, to various objects or scenes in life, rather than to some kind of abstract, sort of, abstract practice. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I suppose connects me to the last questions that I have for both of you, which are really thinking about the students who've been reading the book as part of the shortlist, and thinking about them also as potential writers or translators. And I wanted to first maybe ask Mark a little bit about this, and then Anne will finish with a question for you. So Mark, this probably seems like an obvious question, but it certainly interests me. I wanted to know how you learned French, and how you became or started to become a literary translator.
Yeah, that's quite well. The French side is sort of very straightforward. You know, French is the first foreign language that we that we all let British kids learn in school. I think this is unchanged. You know, you do it in primary school when you get your first French lessons. When you're about 7, I think it must be 7 or 8. Yeah, so I did French at school, you know, in primary school, but then I did it.
Quand t'es arrivé en France.
Hold on.
Ouais.
Hold on.
Ouais.
Yeah, hold on. We're going to get there. Then I did it at A level as well. I took my O levels French slightly because we had a very good class in my school, so we did our O level a year early, and then I did A level French. So I already had, you know. So then I moved to France when I was 23. I moved to Paris, which is slightly different from moving to France. So by that time, I'd already been, you know, studying French, you know, at some level for 10 years or whatever, you know, up to A level. So I had 10 years French. So I spoke decent French, you know, when I got here. But of course, when I sat down at a table with 10 people, you know, with the conversation darting about in 27 different directions for 2 hours, I was completely lost for the first 6 months. And it took about 6 months before I caught up. But, you know, you catch up quickly. And I used to do things like, you know, when I first arrived, one of the first French books I bought when I arrived in France was Flaubert's Trois Contes, you know, his wonderful little 3 tales. Amazing one, probably my favorite of all Flaubert's books. And I had a little notebook in which I copied down, you know, because you need to expand your vocabulary. What you don't, you know, even if you've done 10 years French, if you don't speak it every day, you don't have a lot of vocabulary. So I used to note down. You know, when I moved to France, I had to earn a living like everybody. And I was a poet in those days, and I stopped writing poetry when I was about 30, although I've always read poetry and translate poetry and read it every day. But for all kinds of reasons, I stopped writing poetry when I was 30, roughly. And so, you know, you have to earn a living. I'm a bit of a hard case, so I did not want to go and work in an office. I'm a bit stubborn. I wanted my freedom, you know, because otherwise it's like you just got out of school and you're going back into school in adult life, and that's the last thing I wanted to do. So I think, no, I'm free, and I never want to be unfree again. I want to decide what I do with my time. So that means you can only work freelance. So I did huge quantities of all kinds of things, you know. I worked for the Louvre for a long time. I set up the Louvre's website. That when they decided to do an English language website, I vetted all the translators. I spent a year vetting the translators and sort of setting up a style guide and stuff like that. Literary translation. Poetry, I've always, you know, if I like a poem in French, it's you know, I immediately want to translate it because I want to understand it better, you know, and because it's not my native language, it's always ever so slightly unreal to me, something in French. So it's a kind of, by instinct, I'll want to then translate it into English because I love the poem, and I want to see how this feels in English. And then Anne, when Barbara Epler and New Directions took an interest in Anne, I thought, well, if Anne's going to be translated to English, I better do this because it's very important, I think, that a writer not only be translated well, obviously, but that they have one translator rather than 4 or 5. What often happens with foreign writers is they end up being translated by 4 or 5 different translators, and some of the translation is good, some are not so good, and it really sort of messes up their reception in the English-speaking world. So it's better to have a single translator. And because I'm an old friend of Anne's, I know at least that I'm going to go all in and push it as far as I can and go the extra mile or the extra 10 miles or the extra 100 miles, to make it as perfect as possible.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think that's exactly the sort of energy as well that Anne you were kind of referencing in your one sentence to the students, this idea that reading this book might make people want to write their own. And they are kind of, well, not quite 19, but probably 16 to 18 people who are reading this book. And I think that leads me really nicely, this idea of kind of a few, kind of flowering, that's not a nice metaphor, a beginning enthusiasm for literature. And I suppose that leads me to my last question for you, Anne, which is that many of the readers for the Schools Laureate are in their final 2 years of school, so 19, not 19, 16 to 18, maybe even. They might also be wanting to write their own poetry collection and sell it in a cafe. They might also go on to study French literature or literature in English or another language. And some might be writers already or feel they might want to write. And I suppose I wanted to ask you, how might a young writer begin to write?
En imitant. Mon premier livre, quand j'avais 13 ans, livre entre guillemets, quand j'avais une passion pour le Club des 5, The Famous Five. Les Famous Five existaient en français aussi. Et j'avais une passion pour le Club des 5. Et donc, j'ai écrit 2 livres quand j'avais 13 ans qui s'appelaient Le Clan des 7. Et c'était très inspiré du Club des 5. Et j'ai commencé par l'imitation, voilà, comme ça. C'était des choses que j'ai faites, mais mon père avait une secrétaire qui a tapé les livres à la machine. Donc, c'était quand même des petits manuscrits. Voilà, j'ai commencé comme ça. Et ensuite, j'ai eu un professeur de français, de littérature, quand j'étais en première, c'est-à-dire quand j'avais 15 ans, qui m'a conseillé de tenir des carnets. Elle trouvait que j'étais une bonne élève, que je m'intéressais déjà, je lisais beaucoup, etc. Et elle m'a dit, vous devriez tenir des carnets, noter des choses qui vous intéressent, etc. Donc, j'ai un petit peu commencé là, très jeune. Et alors, il est arrivé un événement merveilleux. Alors, je lisais beaucoup, depuis l'enfance, je lisais beaucoup. Il y avait beaucoup de livres à la maison, on aimait la littérature, et j'aimais lire parce que c'était la chose qui me rendait le plus heureuse. C'était mon plus grand bonheur, c'était lire des histoires. Et quand j'ai eu 16 ans, j'ai lu un roman très célèbre de André Gide qui s'appelle Les nourritures terrestres. Et dans ce roman, qui est à peine un roman, c'est une forme très étrange, ce livre, le narrateur dit à un personnage, tu aimes mon livre, eh bien maintenant, jette mon livre et écris le tien, et écris un livre que personne n'aura jamais écrit. Voilà. Donc, j'ai pris ça à la lettre, j'ai écouté André Gide, j'ai jeté les nourritures terrestres et j'ai commencé à écrire des histoires. C'est vraiment comme ça que ça s'est passé.
C'est merveilleux. C'est merveilleux. On pourra conseiller, we can
voilà.
advise all the students, yeah.
Et surtout, l'idée de jeter les nourritures terrestres.
Oui.
Oui, de dire, je n'ai plus besoin des nourritures terrestres.
Voilà. Jette mon livre et n'écris un livre que personne n'a jamais écrit. Ah, c'était une porte ouverte pour devenir écrivain.
C'est une porte merveilleuse. Eh bien, I think on that note, this idea that after André Gide, we throw away the book that we're reading and start to write a book that hasn't been written yet. I think that's a wonderful place to close. Thank you so much, Mark and Anne, for talking to me.
Thank you so much to you.
And yeah, no, this was wonderful. And thank you everyone for reading the books, and for listening to us speak together today. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.